The mansion fell silent, not because someone shouted, but because a hand stopped in mid-air. Under the crystal chandelier, Clarissa Benson's fingers were poised like a spear. Light picked out the diamond ring she wore. It glittered as defiantly as she did. Opposite her, a small maid, new here, still smelling faintly of distant village rains and hard cassava, had wrapped her own fingers around that raised wrist and would not let go. Time narrowed to 3 bodies and a single held line of flesh. Clarissa's jaw tightened. The servants at the edges of the room inhaled as one. And in the dark of the hallway, where the portrait of Anderson Tech's founder looked down like a judge, Chica Anderson stopped mid-step and watched. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the house exhaled in a dozen quiet ways. A teacup set down too hard, a napkin left mid-fold, a foot hitting the floor. The chandelier trembled with the smallest sound of the room that had always been louder for Clarissa's voice than for anything else. This is where the story reroutes. To understand why a wrist could change everything, you must go back 3 weeks. If character-driven dramas are your thing, like and subscribe for more. 3 weeks earlier, Lagos was a sun that rose on Chica Anderson like an old promise. He wore his wealth in ordinary gestures, arriving early at foundation clinics, listening to a woman who ran a shelter for boys as if the smallest complaint mattered, turning down a private suite in favor of a public clinic to open a program for school fees. The city loitered in his wake with approval. Newspapers folded his quotations into columns about humility. People liked to say Anderson Tech was different because of him. Clarissa moved differently. She belonged to photographs, silk and tailored suits, a smile trained to dim the room into her shadow. She had learned how to present generosity as a charm and entitlement as etiquette. At charity luncheons, she laughed sweetly and explained to donors how best to give. At home, she corrected the cook's salt with a look sharp as a pin. Guests loved her. Staff learned to obey to avoid being the next lesson. The staff's obedience came from more than fear of dismissal. Wages fed parents and children in towns far beyond Ikoi's gated walls. A lost job meant a season of hunger. That knowledge curdled every reprimand into a threat. When Clarissa snapped, no one answered back. They swallowed and learned to speak in soft measures when they had to speak at all. Amaka arrived on a wet Tuesday. She carried a plastic bag with 2 folded dresses and a small tin head of soap. Her hair, braided into tight rows, carried the smell of palm oil and the sweet, smoky scent of a village fire. She had come for work because her mother's coughing had grown worse, and the clinic bills were piling like rainwater. She was from a place where names were said like prayers. She had gone to Lagos with a single-mindedness that left her face serious, even when she smiled. Mama Tissa was the household's memory. She had been with the Andersons long enough to have trained Clarissa when the girl had first come into the house as a daughter of privilege, hungry for the etiquette of Lagos's finest circles. Mama Tissa's hair had silver threads braided into a crown. Her voice could be soft and final at the same time. When she watched Amaka arrange her belongings, she said nothing for a while. Then she took Amaka's hand in both of hers and spoke like a woman passing on armor. Here, keep your head. Work with humbleness, but not at the cost of your dignity. Amaka nodded. She did not speak about the money she wanted to send home or the nights she had stayed awake listening to her mother cough. She listened to the other maids, a low chorus of cautions. Keep clear of anger, never take blame, never be alone with Clarissa when she is cross. They recited examples, not to frighten but to instruct. Clarissa's moods were geography. Everyone learned the maps. At first, Amaka kept to the edges. She made the bed smooth as river stones. She peeled oranges in neat spirals on Saturday mornings. She learned where the spare towels were kept and which sauces were Clarissa's favorites. She was quick with a smile and slower with explanation. She sent half her wages home and kept the rest in a little bank account that felt to her like a growing promise. It was the small cruelties that marked Clarissa for the staff, a dress left on the carpet because, in Clarissa's eyes, a crease was an affront, a misfolded napkin, a late cup of coffee. Each incident alone would have been a reprimand. Strung together, they made a pattern. There was a way she moved through the house, a sharpness in casual commands that made people shrink. The first public wound arrived like a missing note in a chord. Clarissa could not find her bracelet. It belonged to a collection she wore like sentences, each bracelet an assertion. The morning she noticed it gone, the household gathered under a kind of alarum. Clarissa's voice ricocheted through the corridors. Where was that bracelet? She paced over the marble as if the answer were lodged between the veining. She called the manager and asked for a search. She accused, delicately at first. Someone must have taken it, no? And then with increasing certainty, as hope did not present itself. She laid out her arms and presented her wrists as if they were question marks. Accusation in that house was a weapon with two edges. It could put someone out and cut their family's hands off at the same time. A maid named Nkechi wept in the service stairwell. Others tightened their lips and nodded. Clarissa's face did not tremble with guilt. She was a woman of intentions, at least when those intentions suited her story. She said, "It's not right for things to disappear when people aren't careful," and the sentence landed on the staff, as if judgment were sand. Amaka watched, but did not immediately speak. She was careful by upbringing, yes, but she had also seen the strain on her own mother's face whenever money was short. Accusation could turn a houseworker into a scandal that reached back to a village. She felt the weight of that, of what losing wages would mean, like a physical soreness in her chest. A week of searching changed the tenor of the household. Clarissa tried on other bracelets, as if testing new accents. She asked at dinner one night about a maid's movements, and the girl stammered, eyes wide, hands folded to the handle of her plate. Clarissa's tone when she corrected someone was never merely correction. It was theatrical, designed to produce witnesses. Chica, when he was home, did not see most of it. He was given reports by house managers and reassured with excuses, items misplaced, a careless boy. He trusted Clarissa's curated charm the way strangers did. Her public smile was the face he knew. Sometimes he stepped into the staff quarters and brought jollof for people who couldn't leave the house to collect meals. Sometimes he listened to a cleaner's remark and treated it like news. That temper of attention was part of why people all the way to the clinic line trusted him. But Chica also had his blind spots. He liked to imagine that the warmth he extended could blunt cruelty at the edges. He believed, in ways that were kind but naive, that loyalty to a person could fix what a person did not yet admit. Loving people is not a superpower. It is a practice. Chica had practiced it publicly and privately. He had not practiced suspicion. The bracelet episode frayed that assumption. Clarissa, when pressed, let her voice crack into a thin vulnerability. And Chica, who had loaned her the crest of his name in society, replied with a quiet of his own. "We'll look into it." That was all. And for a moment, when men in suits murmured about dogged inquiries and maids held their breath, things seemed to balance. Then came the night of the dinner. Clarissa had assembled guests, partners in philanthropy, a member of the board, a few high-profile friends who liked to clink wine and speak of development. The dining room was staged like a theater. Candles, a long, polished table, place cards in hand-calligraphed script. Clarissa moved through it like a conductor, offering a laugh here, a compliment there. The house hummed with activity. The staff moved through the background with the practiced silence of professionals. Midway through the main, Clarissa's smile tightened when someone joked about charity runs. She excused herself and said the bracelet's absence had returned to her mind with new sharpness. The manager tried to calm her, The butler offered reassurances. Clarissa's nails found the table's edge and made small crescents. The guests, used to the theatre, expected an explanation. Instead, Clarissa produced a small black phone and scrolled, an act that in those rooms reads as holding court. She asked for the maids to be called individually. One by one, they were brought before the dinner's light, as if to be examined. Clarissa's voice with them was cool as glass. A word here, an accusation there, posture not to be defended against. Amaka stood last, breathing quietly, hands folded at her waist. The scene tilted when Clarissa, with a cold, rehearsed gentleness, accused the staff of carelessness that edged toward theft. The guests glanced, curious at the domestic drama. There was a quickness in the room like the snap of a camera. Amaka looked down. She kept her head low, but her hands did not tremble. The maids inspired small murmurs of sympathy and fear. No one wanted to end up on the wrong side of Clarissa's displeasure. Words in that house had consequences that reached far beyond the room. When Clarissa insinuated, it was a choice. She may have thought she could make an example, keep order, show the staff their limits. Or perhaps she had become used to forcing narratives until they fit. The difference between someone correcting and someone crushing was a measure of intent, and Clarissa's intent had narrowed over time. When she stepped so far as to reach out, when she raised her hand toward Nkechi's face as if to strike, a silence colder than the chandelier's light fell. Hands lifted. A cup fell. Muffled gasps slid under the table. The table's polished surface was an altar upon which reputation and fear balanced. No one expected Amaka to catch the wrist, but she did. Her hand closed like a small, steady clamp. She was not loud. She was not theatrical. She held the raised arm as one holds the edge of a life raft, with quiet certainty. Her fingers did not tremble. The air snapped. Clarissa pulled back, surprised more than angry at first. Her mouth formed a line, eyes narrowing in a way that made the guests look away. The magnitude of being stopped in the act, by someone so low in the social scale, was not humiliation. It was distortion. Clarissa had been used to compliance serving as proof of her rightness. Now a pair of plain fingers contradicted that proof. The staff watched. Some of them tried not to let hope rise inside their chests. The butler, a man who had learned to carry his concern in a thin smile, waited at the doorway as if to measure the inevitable fallout. The guests, trained to read these scripts, waited for the defensive punchline that usually followed, a suggestion that the maid was insolent, a quick firing, a wink to seal the lesson. Chica remained in the hallway. He had come down to fetch a tie and found himself stopped, not by the drama, but by how it landed on the small pair of hands that held an arm in the center of his home. His first sensation was not moral clarity, but a stilled surprise. This is not how his house conducted its affairs. He had expected the scene to be managed away. Instead, someone had refused to let the management of voices do its backward sweep. He stepped forward now, not yet with words, but with a kind of attention that had weight, because it usually brought others with it. His presence shifted the audience. Clarissa's eyes flicked to him in a way that read as calculation. She smoothed her expression and, like someone switching masks mid-performance, smiled at the guests. "Just a moment," she said to them. "Household matters." The room constricted again. Clarissa's posture was brittle now. She straightened, as if aligning herself to some internal rule book. She could make a louder scene. She had done it many times. Or she could save it for someone else's ears. For a long time, Clarissa had learned to choose the audience carefully. Amaka did not let go immediately. She kept her fingers on warm flesh, steady as if holding a child who might fall. Her voice when she spoke was soft and exact. "Madam, there will be no hitting here." It was not daring as much as it was a plain fact. This is not allowed in this house, to be struck. Clarissa's mouth opened, closed, opened like someone fumbling a script. The guests shifted in their seats, feeling that they had been asked to witness more than a performance. Clarissa's lips twitched into a laugh too tight to be a joke. "How bold," she said. The phrase angled at Amaka like a blade. Amaka looked up finally. Her eyes were not flamed with resentment. They were steady, like someone who had learned to see hardship clearly and name it. "I will not be touched," she said. The simplest sentence can feel enormous in the right room. Chica's chest moved once. He would later remember the sensation as a loosening. Not a decisive turning. Men do not change like snapped fingers, but a small seismic shift in a belief held tenderly. That proximity to prestige could mutely correct cruelty. He felt for the first time in many days that what he had called home needed the sort of listening his charity told him he had. Rigorous, uneven, necessary. Clarissa stood back a fraction, then pulled her hand away, as if the thing she had raised to strike had recoiled. She made herself small and magnificent at the same time. She said, with a voice like folded glass, "You will speak of this to no one." The maids exhaled in a sound that might have been laughter, or might have been the beginning of a prayer. Amaka kept her fingers on the wrist, long enough to be certain no further motion would be made. The butler's face had lines he rarely showed. Someone in the back, one of the drivers, murmured a word that was not audible. Chica did not move to scold Clarissa. He did not take the dramatic paternal stand that some onlookers might have expected. He considered. He listened to the small inflammation of people's faces, the redness around Nkechi's eyes, the butler's stiff posture, Clarissa's pale tightening. He understood in a way that was not immediate, but would bend towards clarity. The household was not functioning only on his name or his money. It was operating on fear, habit, and the quiet tolerations of the underpaid. He felt for the first time in his life the weight of an inherited domestic order. The living room, for all its crystal and silk and polished wood, felt suddenly like a stage, with the lights turned down. Clarissa rearranged the conversation with guests as if nothing had occurred. She smoothed the edges of her smile until it was safe to show. Her words toward the table were practiced. She invited a toast to the evening's cause and dismissed the maids as if small matters could be dismissed. But Chica's gaze lingered on the small hand holding an arm. He did not yet speak, and the silence he left in place was not passive. It made room for ruminations and for a conscience to find voice. The tipping moment was not a melodramatic speech, but a slow thought forming. This house, as comfortable as it looked, had a system that allowed cruelty to reproduce itself. He had trusted a face and a smile for too long. When the guests finally left, clutching their invitations and their charitable pledges, the house did not immediately release the stillness. The maids moved like people who had survived a small storm. Clarissa stood at the window, fingers loose at her side, and in the reflection of the glass, she looked smaller than she usually did in pictures. The chandelier's light caught her ring and the tiny lines that worry had etched at the corner of her brow. Later, when the staff rooms emptied and the radio in the kitchen played low talk about traffic on the Lagos Expressway, Amaka stood before her small cot and folded a dress with the precision of someone who counted each movement for value. She did not boast about what happened. She had done what she felt was right. And yet, in the quiet of the night, she let the thought move through her. One small action can create a ripple. She had no idea how polished and heavy that single moment would be when it landed in a house like theirs. She did not know that a single captured wrist could be read by a future as either an act of insolence or an act of courage, depending on how the person who wore the name in front of the house chose to listen. Chica did not sleep well. He turned the event in his mind not as a scandal, but as data. The art of curation had hidden cruelty. His home's bright veneer had thin places where pain could leak. He thought about the maids he passed without hearing truly their needs. He thought about the Foundation's reports he had accepted at face value. A small unease lodged in him, an irritation that would not be soothed by the clean lines of his morning schedule. Word of the incident did not stay inside the mansion walls for long. Staff called relatives and whispered in markets. Men at the clinic swapped versions like object stories, some small, some exaggerated, until the tale was a tapestry of truth and rumor. Clarissa sent brief notes to confidants about an unfortunate insubordination, and friends asked delicately if this was the sort of thing that would blow over. It is always tempting, when one's edges are threatened, to imagine containment. Inside the house, the manager took the precise steps that management requires. Lists were drawn up, interviews scheduled, and an official inquiry prepared in the language of procedures. Clarissa requested privacy, and those who owed jobs to the household bowed to that request because livelihood persuades even the most courageous to temper their protest. Amaka kept to work, but evenings brought faces at the window that long after the guests left would look onto the house and wonder. The maids asked whether she feared loss of job. She said she did not. She knew the stakes. She would not be reckless. But she could not sleep either without thinking that, for once, her small hand had been the hinge on a larger door. Clarissa, meanwhile, did what women of her class do when they feel an order of life is threatened. She composed herself and began to plan. The humiliation she felt was not just damage to pride. It was a crack in a public narrative she had invested in. She had spent time shaping how she moved through rooms, how she smiled on tapes, how she represented grief and loss for cameras at benefit auctions. The bargain of being part of Chica's life was a promise, and promises have ways of shaping action. She could choose to let this incident be one of those obscure domestic outrages that disappear with a written apology and a reduction of staff, or she could turn it into something else. When Clarissa considered something else, her mind moved to containment, to explanation, to narrative control. She remembered small missteps she had endured as a girl, humiliations at the hands of those who thought teaching was better than kindness, and how she had learned to preempt weakness with magnificence. That history had made her both vigilant and dangerous. She did not think of herself as cruel. Cruelty is a hard word until someone else names it and refuses to look away. The days between the living room incident and the bracelet's dramatic accusation stretched with careful pauses. Clarissa made a public show of composure. She sent small gifts to some staff members who had been present that night, an attempt to realign loyalties the way a woman might scatter breadcrumbs. Some responded with gratitude, others accepted with faces closed. Words between the staff turned easier as the months of small terrors found focus. Perhaps change might be possible if someone with Chica's ear listened. Chica listened. He sat across from Mama Tisa as she prepared dinner in the household kitchen and asked about the family's routines. Her answers were plain, rooted in memory and fact. She told him about Clarissa's temperament in the past and how it had been smoothed sometimes with time and sometimes hardened by new privileges. He asked gently, and she answered in proverbs and straight lines, as if saying the truth required both. "Young man," Mama Tissa said, the line of her mouth steady as mortar. "People carry what they were given in the house they left. Some never give it away." It was not a condemnation. It was a map. Chica's charity had never been meant to be a substitute for moral government in his home. But there was a difference between trying to be kind in the world and allowing the world inside the house to set its own rules. He felt that difference now, in the small burn under his skin that refused to lie down. Amaka continued to send money home. She visited the clinic to visit a woman who once tutored her little brother, and she brought herbs and small pleasures that would make an evening bright. She kept a careful ledger in her head: fare, food, family needs. She did not imagine herself a heroine. She imagined herself a daughter trying to keep a roof where a cough would not become a funeral. The night the bracelet was declared lost again, Clarissa's fury roared in new shapes. She demanded the house manager produce camera logs, check bags, search lockers. She spoke to the staff like a queen discussing treason. The kitchen had the low murmur of people who had worked together long enough to know each other's rhythms. Now those rhythms jittered. It was under these strained circumstances that the living room confrontation replayed itself with clearer edges. Clarissa, perhaps pushed by the pressure of being out of control in an arena she believed she mastered, moved to make an example. She performed accusation as if it were a ceremony, steps, a lifted hand, a strict recitation of the charges. But Amaka, newly attached to the idea that no one should be struck, again closed her fingers around a wrist. The second time the hand was raised, there was less of a hush and more of a held breath. People began to believe that the act might define the evening, and possibly more. Clarissa's face altered. Pride is an elastic thing. When it is pulled tight, it can cut, and when it is loosened, it snaps back. When it snapped back, it was into the moment we opened with. Clarissa's hand arrested in mid-air, Amaka's fingers firm. Chica in the hallway finding for the first time that his house had fissures beneath its marble floors. They stood like that for a long measure of beats. In the corridor outside the room, a portrait of the Anderson family watched with painted eyes. Inside, the chandelier trembled as laughter, small and brittle, died. The guests' candles guttered low. The table's cloth hid crumbs that no one wanted to tend to. In that silence, something inside Clarissa shifted. Not repentance, certainly, but the sharp edge of being exposed. "What is happening here?" Chica said finally, his voice small in the grandness of the room but heavy enough to be heard. Clarissa looked at him in a flash of calculation, first to see whether his presence would reconstitute the hierarchy she relied on. There was a moment she weighed her options. Then she smoothed a smile she had used in photographs and said, "A moment of trouble with the staff. Nothing to worry the guests." Chica did not smile back. He let his gaze sweep the room in a way that catalogued faces and responses. Then he turned his gaze to Amaka's hand. He noticed the small calluses at the base of her fingers, the neatness of her nails, the steadiness of her hold. "You let go," he said quietly. Amaka blinked, as if the question had been softer than she expected. She released the wrist then, slowly, like someone freeing a bird. Clarissa drew her arm in as if having been robbed of a trophy. She pressed 2 fingers to her neck and swallowed. The household was no longer a landscape where Clarissa dictated the weather. That fact had not yet become a moral crisis so much as an incision. The incision had bled. Chica felt it in his chest, a small, persistent ache that asked for more than a rearranging of servants. He had been loved in the city for listening. Now listening meant more than headlines. Outside, Lagos hummed. Inside the mansion, the dinner candles were being relit by hands that had seen too many ups and downs to trust the light without watching. Clarissa turned away from the room and went to the window, and for a moment her reflection looked hollow in the glass. Amaka walked back to her duties, folding a napkin with the exactness of someone who treated small tasks as moral contracts. She did not gloat, nor did she shrink. She held a belief like a small lamp. Dignity cannot be given, it can only be recognized. Chica stayed in the doorway watching. The house had always shown him comforts. Now it showed him an economy he had neglected, the economy of regard. He closed the door gently behind him and did something that would have consequences he did not yet fully imagine. He asked quietly for Mama Tissa. The request was small. Mama Tissa approached him, wiping hands on a cloth. She did not need to be told the event. She had seen the way Clarissa's voice had echoed in the marble. She came with the slow gravity of a woman who keeps memory in her pockets. "What do you think?" she asked Chica, avoiding sensationalism. Chica looked into the room where Clarissa stood with her back to the city, a silhouette against the light. "I think," he said, the sentence measured like a scale, "that our home should not make fear the price of work." Mama Tissa's eyes softened. "It must be kept so," she said, "but not by keeping quiet, by tending what is wrong." That night, Chica did not promise to storm Clarissa with public shame. He promised instead to learn the house he had built. It was a tentative promise, the kind that begins with small acts, conversations with staff, listening to complaints, making sure that reports were not smoothed over. He had not yet decided what he would do about the bracelet, or the accusation, or the larger pattern. He had only, in that narrow chamber between pride and pain, begun to tilt. Outside the mansion gates, Lagos slept in thirds: the market, the nightlife, the quiet residential quarters. The detonations of this small domestic revolution would not be immediate. But when a small maid's hand closes around a hand accustomed to striking, the ripples are not subtle. They move toward people who have been waiting to be heard. Clarissa locked her fingers around the notion of being wrong, like a woman trying to hold a blade that would not cut. Somewhere deep in the house, a radio spoke of a traffic jam on the third mainland bridge, and then switched to the smooth voice of a morning host, promising solutions. The mansion, for the moment, was a place where the solution would not be immediate. In the kitchen, the staff exchanged looks that contained hope and fear in equal measure. Amaka returned to her cot and lay awake for a long time, thinking about her mother's cough and the little ledger of remittances stacked like soft coins in her mind. She had not asked for recognition. She had asked only to be treated as a human, which is a small request until it becomes a revolution. Days would follow that brought guest lists, manager memos, and glances that no one would ignore. For now, a handheld spark had been lit. It would take time to see whether that spark became a blaze that cleared away rot, a quiet smolder that burned in place, or a flash that was smothered by power and smooth talk. As dawn folded into Lagos and the city's merchants rolled up awnings, Chica stood at the sink and watched the light crawl across the tiles. He had promised himself an inquiry, but more than that, he had promised to be honest with the house that bore his name. Honesty, he thought, was not a performance. It was a set of hard, small things, asking questions, listening without defensiveness, and doing what needed to be done, even when it hurt. A knock came at the gate later that afternoon, sharp and unexpected. It echoed through the mansion like a footfall in a quiet church. The staff paused. The household manager frowned. Clarissa, who had been arranging throw pillows to look as if nothing had occurred, turned as if she expected the knock to bring something useful. The door was a hinge. That's how answers come sometimes: a knock, a push, a single man who will not accept the story that has been given. The house, which had begun to breathe differently after that held wrist, now heard a sound that would, in time, demand more than explanations. Inside, Amaka folded a towel and listened. The air tasted of rain and potential. The house that had always been governed by status would soon find that status was not an impenetrable shield. Little by little, the lives of those inside it were rearranging in ways they had not expected. But the rest of the night's business, who came to the gate, what was said behind closed doors, the messages that waited, the recordings no one had yet found, those were matters the house would have to answer for. The wrist, held and then released, had lit a path. Whether that path would lead to truth, to fury, to healing, or to a quiet dismissal, remained to be seen. For now, the chandelier continued to sparkle above polished wood, and Amaka's hand, once more empty, rested in her lap like a promise that did not belong to any one person. She had done the smallest courageous thing. She had refused to be humiliated. And in a house like that, sometimes a single refusal is the first stone of an avalanche. The knock at the gate sliced through the house's low hum like a single bright bell. Conversation thinned in the rooms. Someone paused mid-fold. The household manager, a man practiced at smoothing disturbances, answered with the polite stiffness of someone who knew visitors could be trouble. When the gate opened, the figure in the compound was not a solicitor or a vendor, but a familiar, worn face from the kinds of pasts people in Ikoyi rarely spoke about aloud. Chief Benson, Clarissa's father. He moved with the slow certainty of a man who had climbed and then been surprised by the height itself. His shirt was plain, his shoes dusty, and his eyes carried the weight of things he had kept from his daughter until keeping became its own cruelty. Clarissa saw him from the window first. For a moment, her composure shattered into very small, sharp pieces. She smoothed her skirt with fingers that trembled and forced a smile. The arrival of her father in person pivoted the night from maintenance to reckoning. He did not come to the drawing room for niceties. He asked for Chica, then found Mama Tissa in the corridor, and the two of them stepped into a hush like elders settling a village quarrel. Chief Benson's voice was low. He spoke as if each sentence cost him something. Mama Tissa listened in a way that returned weight to his words. "I have kept a silence too long," he said. "There are things, young Blenda's death, things I never told you. I am sorry." Mama Tissa's face did not soften so much as a line. There was no theater in her reaction, only the precise laws of consequence. "Tell him," she said to Chica, who had joined them with a patient expression and hands folded. Chief Benson told the story not as a confession for pity, but as an unspooling of consequence. Years earlier, when Clarissa was younger and learning how to make the city love her, there had been a servant girl in his household who made a mistake and paid for it with blame. Clarissa, then a woman in the throes of being taught how to wield shame as armor, accused the girl of theft. The girl fled in shame and fear. She did not return. Chief Benson, full of the pragmatism that often attends men who have built fortunes, had kept quiet because silence protected his daughter and the name he had labored under. He had thought secrecy might be mercy. Instead, it became a chain. Chica listened without response at first. The weight of years folded into the present, what had been swept into family closets, had a temperature. He felt the small stabbing of failure, that he had not known all the histories that shaped the woman he loved. He did not in that moment set himself above the past. He simply let the facts settle like stones on a table. Clarissa, when she heard the words, did not fall into neat repentance. She moved between panic and calculation. Pride has many tools. She stood before her father and pleaded to keep the matter quiet. Her voice broke on strings of fear. What would this do to the image built around the Anderson name? What would it mean for promises already given in public to donors and councils? Her panic smelled of a woman well practiced in saving appearances. Chief Benson's face folded, as if the confession had become a bruise under his ribs. "I thought I could protect you," he said. "I was wrong to hide it. If there is blame to be shared, it is mine." Clarissa's reaction was a thin, dangerous sound between a sob and an order. She begged her father to speak differently to Chica, to frame the story so that it would not be ruinous. Her pleas read as self-preservation, and the room measured them as such. The household held its breath. For a long time, silence can be a force field. It repels the truth simply by existing. Chief Benson had broken that field. The change was immediate. Clarissa's face twisted in ways that made the maids look away. She moved as one who had been shown a photograph of herself and found she did not like what she saw. "We are going to speak properly," Mama Tissa said finally, not to shame, but to order the work at hand. "We will do it with the law, with respect, and not with gossip. There is a time for tears, and a time for action." Clarissa clutched at her father's sleeve as if to keep him a shield. Please, she whispered. Not yet. There are ways. Not yet is the very phrase that buries the living, Chief Benson interrupted. His voice was neither cruel nor tender. It simply pushed the piece into motion. If a family is to survive what it has done, it must name it. The household manager and Mama Tisa arranged chairs in a quiet ring. Chica watched the scene, his features calibrated between grief and responsibility. He had not asked for drama in his life. He had asked for moral clarity. This was one of those moments when the two did not align neatly. News inside the house travels with the speed of wind. A driver who overheard the whisper left to fetch logs. The maids tried to continue work, but their movements were thin as patched sails. Clarissa retreated to her room as if to assemble herself again in the image she believed would save her. She spoke on the phone in tight fragments, her voice a bright, brittle thing. She called longtime friends. She asked for counsel. Each call seemed to tighten the noose of the secret she had kept. Then, before the family had finished the small ritual of confession and planning, another knock came at the gate. This time, not a careful, dignified arrival, but a knock that rattled like demand. It was louder, younger, edged with weathered anger. The driver opened to reveal a man who wore grief like an old shirt. Samuel Okoro. Samuel did not come with the polish of the city. His clothes bore the road and the truth. He carried himself as someone who had spent years being taught where to stand in the world, and had spent longer still refusing to remain quiet. He announced himself plain and loud. He was the brother of the girl who had died. The room tightened. Clarissa's face changed color. Chief Benson's confession now had a new gravity. What had been a past thing had found its echo in the present. Samuel's eyes were steady and small sorrowed. He had traveled a long way from a town where names of the dead are kept in the mouths of those who love them. He had come to demand what families had a right to demand. Truth. He did not scream for revenge. He did not seek spectacle. He wanted to know who was responsible. He wanted to hear apologies not holed up in private rooms, but offered in public where they belong. You are the man who carries the name, he said to Chica. If you do not act, we will knock forever. Clarissa confronted Samuel with a brittle aggression that reeked of fear. You have no idea, she snapped. You have the wrong person. Samuel's voice did not rise into righteous thunder. It settled into simple facts. He spoke of a girl named Ijeoma, who had been like a sister to him. He spoke of her leaving in shame and the months of searching before a body was found on a road outside a neighboring town. He spoke of the silence that followed and the way his family had been left with questions. His words were small, but their aim was precise. To be answered. The room tilted toward a kind of tense clarity. Chica felt each syllable like a ledger entry being written under his name. The man he had loved and planned to marry was suddenly revealed to have a history he had the power to judge or to excuse. Clarissa's defense grew thin. In the midst of the confrontation, a phone slid from her pocket and hit the floor with a soft beat that sounded like a heart. It was small and black and slightly scuffed. Someone, Chica, maybe the manager, bent to pick it up. The screen unlocked with a thumbprint or code. The device glowed like an accusing eye. He read a message aloud before anyone could stop him. Is he suspecting anything yet? Move before he finds the papers. The sentence in the air sounded like a verdict. Clarissa's mouth opened, and the practiced armor she had worn for years cracked. Chica's fingers found the audio folder because the phone, by fate or habit, had left the media app open. There it was, a file labeled Plan B. For one suspended second, no one moved. Then, because someone must speak truth plainly when evidence sits heavy on a table, the audio was played. Clarissa's voice came out of the little speaker, closer, triumphant, and small-natured at the same time. She laughed in a way that was sharp as glass. She spoke of marriage not as love, but as architecture, a union that would serve as access to assets, a plan to bind Chica to her, and the possibility of leverage if he ever misstepped. She chuckled, admitted calculations, named people to be quieted, and made plans in the currency of manipulation. The room turned as if under a current. The guests who had been invited for dinner earlier, long since returned to their lives, could not be summoned back to this private reckoning. But in the house, faces changed in an instant from polite curiosity to the bare exposure of betrayal. Clarissa scrambled for a defense, for a denial that could undo audio that had been captured and saved. She clawed, with words that rang false, for a misinterpretation, for a hacked device, for any rationalization. Chica's face unspooled in slow grief. The man who had stood in hallways promising clinics and school fees now understood fully that his personal life had been a part of a plan. He did not yell. He did not launch into melodrama. He pressed the phone to his palm like a weighing stone. He heard what the recording said and found the sound of it like the closing of a door he had in his chest. "What is this?" he said finally, and the question was small but heavy. Clarissa went from pleas to threats to sobs in a breath. She begged him to remember all the times she had held his hand at events, to recall how she had been a partner at his side. She told a story of fear, that she had lived with the constant dread of losing status. She spun a narrative of vulnerability, of a girl shaped by scarcity who had learned the hard craft of survival. Her words tried to weave explanation into confession. Chica looked at her, and then at the faces around him. Mama Tissa's quiet consternation, Chief Benson's bowed head, Samuel's unyielding need for justice, the maid's tight faces, Amaka's measured steadiness. He had to make a decision that was true to the man he had been in public. Principled, generous, deliberate. The choice could not be a spectacle of revenge, but it could not be indifference. He stepped away from the phone and drew a long breath. "I will not marry you," he said, and the room seemed to tilt at the bluntness of a sentence that both ended and began things. "I will not be part of a life built on deception." Those words landed like a small, precise avalanche. Clarissa's face emptied. She clutched at him, then at her father, then at any hand that might be warm. She begged, pleaded, promised to change, to love, to atone. Pain was true on all sides, the pain of betrayal, the pain of exposed wrongs, and the pain of a family torn open. Chica did not answer all pleas with fury. He chose process. He called his lawyer, yes, but before that he called someone else. The number for the local police line. He asked for them to come, to take statements, to begin an investigation. He insisted the matter be handled with dignity and the rule of law. There would be no verdict delivered by the household. There would be documentation and files, and if necessary, courts. That was his way of keeping himself honest, of insisting the public processes take their place. Samuel's posture eased fractionally, but did not soften into triumph. He had not sought to humiliate. He had sought only to be heard. The police who arrived were careful and professional. They took statements from those who had witnessed events and from those who had lived with the secrets. They treated Samuel's testimony with gravity. Clarissa's phone was logged as evidence. Chief Benson offered his full cooperation and spoke of his failings with a kind of blunt remorse. Clarissa was not dragged. She was escorted calmly as required by procedure. Her collapse into weeping was a private and public mixture. A woman who had used other people's pain as an instrument now found herself in front of a legal apparatus that required facts, not displays. The officers slid a set of cuffs when the paperwork allowed and led her out, and the mansion watched the departure of a figure who had once dominated its social spaces. In the aftermath, Chica stood in the hall with Mama Tisa and Amaka and the team of staff who had silently borne the weight of humiliation for years. Samuel spoke quietly, with police, and with Chief Benson. He did not shout for a crowd. He asked what would happen next, how his sister's death would be recognized, what would be done legally. Chica promised to support the family's access to lawyers and records. He promised to make funds available for a proper inquiry into Blender's death. Promise, in that moment, felt like practical love. The household exhaled in the small ways it had learned to do when storms passed. The cook went back to stirring, the driver to checking tires, the maids to folding towels. But nothing was quite the same. The chandelier glinted differently, as if light now found the cracks. The staff began to speak, not in whispers of fear, but in a language edged with the possibility of being heard. Mamata Tisa arranged for a meeting with all staff, where concerns could be raised and recorded. Chica instituted a formal grievance procedure that did not rely on the goodwill of those in power. Amaka, who had simply refused to be humiliated and then stood aside as truth did its work, received quiet recognition. Chica, in front of the staff, thanked her with a kind of dignity that made it clear the house would now run differently. He offered Amaka a written raise and a place in the household where her responsibilities would be clearer and her voice more available to speak out if wrong was done. She accepted in the plain way she had always had, no gloating, no enactment of heroism. Her eyes were steady. She thought of her mother and of the small ledger where numbers meant life. Samuel's involvement did not end in a moment of revenge. He filed complaints, gave testimony, and argued that a full inquiry into his sister's death was necessary. The police accepted statements and arranged for more formal investigations outside the house's walls. Chief Benson, wrung and chastened, began to take steps to make amends that were not only cosmetic, public apologies, funding for Ijoma's family, and cooperation in the legal process. Clarissa, in custody, wept and then grew quieter. Her public persona had dissolved into an image of a frightened woman who had miscalculated. Men and women who had admired her felt betrayal and sorrow, but sorrow did not remove culpability. The law would take its course. The household would have to live with the aftermath of having allowed harm to happen under its roof, and of not putting systems in place to prevent it. In the rooms after the departure, mendings were small and practical. Chica visited the staff quarters often, not in grand gestures, but simply to listen. The staff told their stories, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in clean lines. Mama Tisa orchestrated practical things: who would be in charge of grievances, how to document complaints, where to send staff who might need support. It was not a dramatic salvation, it was a kind of tending, the slow work of rebuilding trust. For Amaka, the changes were both outward and intimate. She had been acknowledged by a man whose name carried weight in the city. She had her wage increased, yes, but she had something more important: the knowledge that an act done in quiet resolve could reorder the lives of many. She went home for a weekend to see her mother, and for the first time in months she felt the ease of bringing money and a story of dignity back with her. Chica sat alone once, on the terrace that looked over the city's now dimmer lights. He thought of the clinics, the boys he had spoken to, the staff he had not listened to closely enough. He thought of the difference between being loved for what you give and being accountable for the shelter you provide. He had lost a planned wedding, yes. He had also gained a clarity about stewardship. His charity would not stop. If anything, it would be more disciplined, more insistent that systems protect the vulnerable rather than serve the appearance of benevolence. Samuel did not leave empty-handed. The legal path ahead was neither swift nor guaranteed, but